I thought I was there to support my husband. To smile, shake hands, and stand quietly beside him while he took credit for a night I helped build. But in front of his investors, his friends, and an entire room full of people who mattered to him, he laughed and called me something I would never forget. A trophy wife past her shine. They waited for me to react. For tears. For humiliation. What they didn't know was that the restaurant behind them, the lights, the music, the champagne, existed because of me. And the moment he said those words, I made a decision. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I let him finish speaking, because sometimes the most powerful response comes after silence. You know what she is? He laughed lightly, raising his glass. A trophy wife who's past her shine. The words sliced clean through the hum of conversation, sharp enough to silence the room. For one suspended second, everything stopped. I stood less than a meter away from him, frozen in place, as the guests at Lumen, his newly opened fine dining restaurant in Seattle, turned their attention toward me. Men in tailored suits. Women wrapped in designer dresses and diamonds. All waiting to see how I would react. My husband, Marcus Hale, stood at the center of it all, confident, relaxed, enjoying the attention like this was nothing more than a clever joke well delivered. Uncertain laughter followed. The uncomfortable kind. The kind people use when they aren't sure if they should be amused or ashamed. I wore the champagne-colored gown he had chosen for me that morning. My hair was styled the way he preferred. My smile was practiced, polished, decorative. Exactly how he liked it. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 30 years old. And until that moment, standing in the middle of the grand opening celebration for the restaurant I had funded, I believed my marriage was built on partnership, believed the 12-year age gap between Marcus and me was irrelevant. That his experience and my ambition balanced each other. That together, we were building something meaningful. All of that shattered the moment he opened his mouth. Marcus turned toward me, still basking in the spotlight, and reached into his jacket. What he pulled out wasn't a gift. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't acknowledgement for the woman who had poured nearly everything she had into making this night possible. It was an envelope. Thick. White. Official. Well, he said smoothly, since we're making announcements tonight, I figured I should be honest too. He held it out between his fingers. Evelyn, I've decided to file for divorce. My attorney prepared the paperwork last week. You understand, right? A pause. A man in my position needs someone who fits the image. The room went silent. Not shocked silence. But curious silence. The kind where people lean in emotionally, eager to witness collapse. They watched me carefully. Waiting for tears. For anger. For desperation. I gave them nothing. I reached forward and took the envelope from his hand. My posture remained calm. My breathing steady. My face unreadable. Years beside Marcus had taught me how to mask emotion, how to smile while breaking. How to remain elegant while being dismantled. Thank you for letting me know, I said evenly. I appreciate the clarity. For the first time that evening, his smile faltered. He had expected me to fall apart. To beg. To give him a scene worthy of gossip and champagne refills. Instead, I turned and walked toward the exit. My heels echoed sharply against the marble floor as Marcus hurried to restart the party behind me, his voice louder than before, laughter forced, control slipping. Outside, the valet brought my car. I drove home alone, the unopened divorce papers resting on the passenger seat. The city lights blurred past my windshield, beautiful and indifferent. I had arrived that evening as a wife. As a believer. As a woman convinced she was valued. I left as something else entirely, and I didn't know it yet. But everything was about to change. I didn't cry that night. Not in the car. Not at home. Not even when I finally sat on the edge of the bed, the divorce envelope still unopened beside me. Instead, I slept. Deeply. It surprised me. Because somewhere beneath the humiliation, something steadier had taken over. The next morning, I made coffee, opened my laptop, and logged into an account Marcus had never asked about. The investment portal. The restaurant, Lumen, wasn't just my idea. It was my capital. 2 years earlier, when Marcus pitched the concept, banks had hesitated. His reputation was flashy, his numbers optimistic, his risk profile generous. I was the one who believed. I was the one who wrote the checks. Quietly. Consistently. Without putting my name on the menu or the press releases. At his request, "It looks cleaner if it's just me," he'd said. "You know how investors are." I did know. And I had agreed. Scrolling through the documents now, the truth settled in. I wasn't just his wife. I was his primary investor. 73% of the initial capital came from me, transferred in stages, protected by contracts I had insisted on reviewing myself, contracts Marcus had skimmed. Assuming I trusted him enough not to need them. By noon, my phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "We should talk. Last night got out of hand." I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded a single document to my attorney. Subject line, "Time to review." She replied within minutes. "Do not sign anything yet. Come in today." When I arrived at her office that afternoon, she read silently for a long time. Then she looked up. "He underestimated you," she said simply. That evening, Marcus called again. This time, his voice was softer. Controlled. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," he said. "You know how events are." I was playing to the room. "I know," I replied calmly. "You always are." There was a pause. "I want this to be amicable," he added. "We can be adults about it." Adults. I almost smiled. Because what he didn't know, what no one at that party knew, was that the spotlight he craved was built on my silence. And silence, once broken, has weight. I hung up without explaining. And for the first time since that night, I opened the envelope he had handed me. Inside were divorce papers dated a week earlier. Confident. Final. He thought the story was already written. He was wrong. I didn't announce my decision. I let it unfold quietly. Over the next few days, I reviewed every agreement tied to Lumen. Each transfer. Each clause. Each contingency Marcus had waved away with a smile and a kiss on my cheek. Had always assumed I was funding a dream. He never considered I was protecting an investment. By Friday afternoon, my attorney and I had a clear path. The contracts allowed me to withdraw my capital with notice, or convert it into controlling equity if certain conditions were triggered. Public humiliation. Material misrepresentation. And breach of marital trust. Marcus had managed to check every box. I sent the notice that evening. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just formal. When his call came, it was immediate. "Evelyn," he said, voice tight, "what is this?" "A consequence," I replied. He laughed nervously. "You're upset. I get it. But this is business. You can't just pull funding." "I can," I said calmly. "I already did." The line went silent. "That would destroy the restaurant," he finally said. "I know," I replied. "You built it that way." His tone shifted then. "Let's not be hasty," he said. "We can talk about terms. I'll apologize. Publicly, if you want. Apologize. Only now." "This isn't about words," I said. "It's about ownership." He exhaled sharply. "You wouldn't do this," he said. "You don't want the mess." I looked around my quiet apartment. The mess was already gone. "I'm not afraid of clean endings," I said. Another pause. "You're overreacting," he snapped. You knew what role you played. That was it. I smiled to myself. I did, I said. And now I'm changing it. I ended the call. That night, news of unexpected funding complications began circulating quietly among his inner circle. Partners grew cautious. Vendors delayed. Marcus started calling more often. Texting longer messages. Leaving voicemails he'd never needed before. And in every one of them, I heard the same thing. Not regret, fear. Because for the first time, the woman he had reduced to decoration was controlling the outcome. And he knew it. Marcus tried to control the narrative. He always did. 2 days after I pulled the funding, he posted a carefully worded statement online. Something about creative differences and a mutual decision to restructure partnerships. It fooled no one important. Suppliers began calling. Investors stopped returning his emails. A private tasting event was quietly cancelled. The cracks spread fast. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Marcus had been pacing the dining room late at night, barking orders at staff, demanding loyalty like it could replace capital. It couldn't. Then he showed up at my apartment. Unannounced. He looked nothing like the man from the opening night. No tailored suit. No practiced smile. Just tension and exhaustion. You're enjoying this, he said bitterly. No, I replied. I'm finished with it. He tried another angle. I built that place, he insisted. My name is on everything. And my money is in the walls, I said. Names fade. Paper doesn't. He sat down heavily. You'll ruin me, he said. I studied him for a moment. You ruined yourself the moment you forgot who made it possible, I said calmly. His voice dropped. If you reverse this, he said, I'll tear up the divorce papers. We can move on. There it was. Not love. Not remorse. Leverage. I shook my head. I don't want a marriage that only works when I stay quiet, I said. He stood abruptly. You think people will side with you, he snapped. You're just the wife. I met his eyes. I was the investor, I said. You just never bothered to remember. He left without another word. That evening, a major hospitality blog published an article questioning Lumen's financial stability. It wasn't an attack. Just facts. Facts are enough. Reservations dropped overnight. Marcus called again. I didn't answer. Because by then, the story no longer needed my voice. It was telling itself. The restaurant didn't close overnight. IT didn't need to. Without my funding, Lumen slowly bled. Staff hours were cut. Vendors demanded upfront payment. The waiting list vanished. Marcus stopped posting. Then, quietly, he stopped calling. The divorce finalized faster than he expected. The papers he once waved so confidently now felt like an escape hatch he hadn't planned for. Didn't fight him for headlines. I didn't give interviews. I didn't explain myself. I didn't need to. The contracts spoke clearly. I exited the investment cleanly, with interest, and redirected my capital elsewhere. Smaller ventures. Women-led projects. Businesses that didn't confuse ego with leadership, they flourished. Months later, I passed Lumen by accident. The lights were dim. The sign looked tired. The place that once shimmered with ambition felt ordinary, and that was the point. What had made it shine was never him alone. It was the foundation he dismissed. I moved into a new apartment overlooking the water. No marble. No chandeliers. Just space and quiet. I slept better than I had in years. One afternoon, a mutual friend mentioned Marcus. He says you destroyed him. I smiled softly. No, I said. I stopped holding him up. That night, I poured a glass of wine and watched the city lights reflect across the river. Wasn't a trophy. I wasn't an accessory. And I was never rusty. I had simply been underestimated. And now, I was free.